I am Ashna Gupta from EPG Pathshala. The title of this module is Application of Criminal Profiling, Merits and Demerits of Psychological Profiling and Future Trends. After studying this module, you shall be able to learn the application of criminal profiling, learn the merits and demerits of psychological profiling, know about the recommendations for future research in criminal profiling. Introduction. Criminal profiling is a discipline within criminology rooted in the behavioral sciences and forensic sciences alike. Criminal profiling involves making inferences about the habitual physical, emotional, psychological, and even vocational characteristics of criminals. However, there are many different methods of criminal profiling and all vary with respect to the soundness of underlying theory, logic and insight. Some methods are general, abstract and trait predictive. Others are specific, concrete and state descriptive. Some rely on offender group statistics, some rely solely on experience, and some rely on examining case-specific behavioral evidence. Criminal psychological profiling is the technique of analyzing the behavioral patterns of a crime or series of crime in order to primarily construct a descriptive pattern of the probable offender. Criminal profiling has been used successfully by law enforcement in several areas and is a valuable tool to narrow the field of investigation. Profiling does not provide the specific identity of the offender. Rather, it indicates the description of the probable offender by focusing on certain behavioral and personality characteristics. Example: age, sex, marital status, and employment status. As used by the FBI profilers, the criminal profile generating process is defined as a technique for underlying the major personality and behavioral characteristics of an individual based upon an analysis of the crimes he or she has committed. The profiler's skill is in recognizing the crime scene dynamics that link various criminal personality types who commit similar crimes. Since its emergence, criminal profiling has been given several different terms to describe the technique. For instance, psychological profiling, criminal personality profiling, criminal investigative analysis, and behavioral profiling. Regardless though of descriptive label applied, profiling as investigative tool today is fully intuitive, based and represents a less than educated attempt to provide law enforcement agencies with detailed information about the behavior of an unknown individual who has committed a crime. For example, most published accounts of profiling which details the methods employed by various individuals have tended to take the form of semi-autobiographical books and journal articles rather than systematic academic work, and hence are difficult to evaluate from an accuracy or scientific point of view. Profiling is effective in cases where the unknown offender has clearly displayed signs of psychopathology. It is suggested that the crime scene's behavior reflects the pathology of the offender's personality. Crimes most appropriate for psychological profiling are those such as sadistic torture in sexual assaults, motiveless fire setting, mutilation murders, rape and ritualistic crimes, and post-mortem slashing and cutting. Three approaches to criminal profiling. The technique of profiling is used widely by investigators from the FBI, consultants in the mental health sector and police. There are three main distinct approaches to criminal profiling: diagnostic evaluations, criminal investigative analysis, and investigative psychology. The three approaches to criminal profiling are: First, diagnostic evaluation. It is regarded as the oldest and most classical approach to psychological profiling. It is regarded by some as the precursor of criminal personality profiling. The approach does not allow any prescribed method or set procedures. Such profiles are developed by consultants with clinical experience. Thus, the approach relies on the understanding of personality theories and mental disorders. The profiles can be regarded as ideographic, and construction of a profile is individually focused, emphasizing the psychopathology and personality. The advantage of using diagnostic evaluation is that they are the easiest to conduct. The disadvantage is that most mental health professionals have minimal experience in criminal investigations. Unfortunately, this lack of experience in the criminal domain may negatively impact the accuracy of the diagnostic evaluation. Criminal investigative analysis. This approach emerged in 1970s, where there was a gush of public interest and concern regarding bizarre and random violent crimes within US. The FBI became increasingly aware that principles from the behavioral sciences supported the application of psychological profiling for investigative purposes. It was recognized that investigators of violent crimes required more specific advice on some cases, particularly if there was no forensic evidence at the crime scene. FBI agents view profiling as an educated attempt based on the behavioral sciences to provide law enforcement agencies with a detailed description of the probable characteristics of the unknown offender. The advantage of using criminal investigative analysis is that it provides to the specific requirements of the investigator. The disadvantages are that the FBI approach does not take into account cultural considerations. Research and development of classification manuals were drawn exclusively from the US. Thus, they may not be relevant for non-US locations. Second, the extensive use of statistics and probabilities to construct the profile ends up focusing less on the individual, in turn placing more emphasis on the personality type of the offender. Next, investigative psychology. It is the most recent approach to criminal profiling. Offender profiling in Great Britain has been developed and researched primarily by university institutions and clinical consultants. A major premise for Cantor is that the time and place of any offense are important factors when profiling an offender. From this, Cantor suggests that mental maps can be identified from the offenses, which can ultimately assist in locating the area where the offender resides. The advantage of this approach is the precise and specific details that contribute to the development of criminal profiles. Cantor noted that as part of the general increase in the quality of police activities, the systematic study of criminal behavior is playing an ever-increasing role. However, the research literature in this area is relatively scarce because it is a fairly new approach to profiling. Further, its theories have yet to be further tested outside the UK. Implications. Although the concept of criminal profiling was strengthened through fictional accounts, it continues to gain momentum in current investigations. The profiler's presence, while noted during court testimony, thus the role of profiling in law enforcement continues to increase. Although the typologies and methods possess their own problems, they indicate larger issues in the field. Profiler training. While criminal profiling remains a tool available to law enforcement agencies, there is extensive variation in the report that will be received. Not only will each of the different profiling methods lead to the distinctions in information, but the individual profiler's background will further affect the final profile. With the exception of behavioral evidence analysis, each of the currently dominating approaches rely on the individual's experience when classifying offense characteristics, and even behavioral evidence analysis considers experience in the interpretation of information. The individual's background must then include exposure to case-specific investigations that include similar behavior. Experience and training are therefore external factors influencing a profile that are not included in the methodology. The dependency on experience demonstrates a problem area for law enforcement when selecting a profiler. The differences in homicide investigation training are most evident in examinations of inter-rater reliability. For the organized or disorganized dichotomy, the agents categorizing the crime scene characteristics disagreed at best 20% of the time, but could extend to as high as 30%. It is then possible that the preliminary classification will agree in less than 2/3 of the cases. This variation affects the product, making selection difficult since interpretations can be completely different. A standardized system outlining training and experience and perhaps licensing can correct these selection problems. The lack of uniformity in the profiles, even within the same method, can be remedied through the implementation of qualification guidelines. This would allow law enforcement to have a basis of knowledge for selecting a profiler. The preliminary system has been proposed by the Academy of Behavioral Profiling in 2004, which aims to develop and promote multidisciplinary education and training, practice, standards, and peer review for those who engage in evidence-based criminal profiling. Through a professional organization, law enforcement agencies would be able to access a profiler's credentials and case history. This will not only allow investigators to select a profiler by their qualifications and methodological approach, but will also encourage the individual's profiler to possess a vested interest in the case beyond the investigatory phase. Law enforcement agencies would be better served by such professionalization, as it would allow the investigators to be better informed in their decision. Profilers' accessibility. Due to lack of uniformity in standards, law enforcement agencies choose the profiler for a case with little recommendation. As a result, criminal profilers are hired as consultants, and the majority of the outsourcing is fielded by active and retired FBI agents. There are currently profilers representing each methodology in the private sector, but the most well-known are those that were at some point affiliated with the FBI. Although their approach of criminal investigative analysis relies heavily on the flawed organized-disorganized dichotomy. It has been heavily lauded and thus reinforced by the media, thereby allowing it to be viewed as an authentic strategy. Profiler selection is then based on marketing and not on quality and accuracy, although that is not to say that the two are mutually exclusive. Still, with existing flaws in the methodology, it is plausible that some approaches and by extension profilers are more accurate than others, and instead of investigators choosing the most useful approach, name recognition is the deciding factor. The final product applied to the investigation is meant to narrow the suspect pool. The importance of its usefulness to a case is compounded by fees that accompanies this service. Profiling utility. While problems within criminal profiling have been identified, the ultimate concern is the profiler's utility for law enforcement. While no concrete definition of effectiveness exists, the intent of this technique is to identify an offender's characteristics, both geographic and behavioral. Accordingly, the profile is meant to serve as an investigative tool, and its utility is determined by the assistance provided to investigators. Thus, the profiler's ability to narrow the investigative suspect pool is identified as the indicator of usefulness, although the exact nature of this assistance remains vague. Despite acknowledgement that this examination was conducted prior to the completion of the study establishing the organized or disorganized dichotomy, this finding continues to use a non-deceit measurement of usefulness. Additional examinations of utility have not been introduced for public review, although in recent years, news media have looked for matching characteristics between the assessable profile and the apprehended offender. A concrete measure of utility for any profiling method is still lacking, and mere assistance does not necessarily involve any new information. Depending on the profile, the characteristics included may only confirm existing beliefs without any additional knowledge. The limitation on the profile's assistance is due in large part to method dependence on typologies. Hence, Holmes in 1998 asserts that a single profile with its broad characterizations and questionable accuracy should be considered with products from other profiles, and the similarities should be used by investigating officers. Such a requirement further restricts accessibility and implies a need for a more accurate and law enforcement appropriate method. The exact utility of existing methods then appears limited, although some alteration may aid investigators in accurately isolating elements of the crime. Recommendations for future research. The downfall of profiling are centered on the corresponding typologies, classifications, and its overall effectiveness appears to be geared towards validation of existing ideas. This implies two evolutionary changes in the criminal profiling field, which would maximize utility for law enforcement agencies. The first involves a shift in the foundation of the profiling process from its application as an art form to one more consistent with the scientific process. This would shy away from existing typologies, a step already initiated by behavioral evidence analysis, and instead using evidence from the individual scenes. Yet, according to those currently practicing this method, the logic and scientific process present mirror that used by investigators, and for that reason a skilled investigator can also serve as a capable profiler. The second alteration to the existing organization is then the elimination of a consultant that compiles the data from the crime reconstructionist and forensic professionals. Instead, additional training can be introduced for homicide detectives, which would address this process of analysis. By integrating this process within the department, policing agencies are only praying for the service of the reconstructionists, since state forensics labs are already factored into the budget, as is the work of investigators instead of using third-party contracts. While such changes to the existing profiling process seem simple, further study is required. Initial action should involve examination on the part of the academics to compare profile characteristics to those of the actual offender and expand upon the reviews of current methodologies and their typologies. These findings should be carried beyond academic circles and into the mainstream media, which presently promote the strength of existing profiling methods as investigative tools. Only through this combined effort can public demand less and material be used to formulate this new approach for proactive investigation. This improved method can borrow from current process, specifically behavioral evidence analysis in the development, provided each of the past problems is addressed. Although it may appear that the deductive approach is, in its present form, the solution to these issues, the considerable time required for the process is problematic. Behavioral evidence analysis is better suited for retroactive application to an investigation such as cold case or one that has completed the apprehension phase, where the necessary time is free from pressures of an active investigation. The new process needs to address these stressors and the time-sensitive nature of the investigation. Perhaps most importantly, the process should be open to review so as to isolate any flaws and identify a means of correction. Though this preliminary evaluation indicates that the actions of a profiler can be incorporated into the duties of law enforcement investigators, later review may indicate otherwise. In the event of a finding that department detectives are able to fill this role or the training cost would exceed those asked by a consultant, criminal profiling should remain an outsourced position. The profiling field, both public and private, however, should undergo professionalization and the creation of general standards of practice. This should include academic and field training, in addition to ethical guidelines. Further, to ensure a constant process of individual performance review, a license program should be implemented. This will both help to make certain that law enforcement receives a qualified profiler and build a positive reputation in the policing field. While many criminal justice practitioners perceiving profiling as voodoo and profilers as glorified mystics, licensing procedures will more closely align this technique with professional sciences. With each of these suggestions, the most important aspect is evaluation, as it will aid the development process and help the technique to evolve into a viable investigative technique. In conclusion, criminal profiling is a discipline within criminology rooted in behavioral sciences and forensic services. Criminal profiling involves making inferences about the habitual, physical, emotional, psychological, and even vocational characteristics of criminals. Offender profiling is the correction of empirical data in order to compile a picture of the characteristics of those involved. Offender profiles aim to narrow down the range of possible suspects rather than solve the actual crime. Offender profiling, while dominated by the media, has entered into the practical realm of law enforcement. Although public opinion asserts that this is a viable tool for policing investigators, the typologies and methodologies are troublesome. While the existing geographic types are valid only after the offender is identified, the psychological classifications lack a solid foundation. Consequently, the methods currently in practice possess basic flaws. However, this does not imply that criminal profiling is unqualified to serve as a tool. since the goal of profiling is identical to standard investigative practices. The concept can then be used for investigations, although not in the method traditionally emphasized. Instead, the case-specific analysis of forensic evidence is a variation of existing procedures used by investigators and can be introduced within departments. Existing methods must accordingly be sacrificed for the development of an accurate and cost-effective procedure to aid in the investigation of homicides. Additionally, this same process for review should be applied to other crimes now using profiling techniques, from sexual assault to arson and even stalking. Since these offenders differ in their characteristics, and a precisely identical process may not be appropriate. The dominant practices of geographic profiling, investigative profiling, criminal investigative analysis, and behavioral evidence analysis each offer a unique approach to understanding an offense and can thus contribute its perspective to a more specific and effective method. Ultimately, criminal profiling requires further study so that it does not continue to be the subject to exist problems. Despite critics' recommendations that the entire practice be eliminated, it has cemented its position in the eyes of the public as a practical technique, and refusal to seek profilers' assistance would lead to a negative portrayal of investigating officers. For this reason, the presence of profiling must be acknowledged, although it can be modified. Crime is not static, and therefore, the field of criminal profiling should simultaneously evolve. The need for continuous exploration into the field itself will help to improve this practice, while the basic tenets of investigation remain constant. In the end, criminal profiling in its current state better serves fictional storylines than active cases. However, if practitioners are able to introduce a new profiling approach that mirrors an established professional technique, the modern view of this tool as nothing more than an elaborative con can be curtailed, and law enforcement will be better equipped to address these high profile and difficult cases. Thank you for joining in.